Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into successfully getting into busy soccer stadiums. We'll be using the guide Stadium Entry, English Vocabulary and Best Practices as our source. And we're going to equip you with the knowledge, but also the right way to say things to make sure you can navigate this sometimes pretty chaotic process.
Yeah, this is really for, I think, the more experienced fan. We're going to be focusing on really kind of advanced strategies and also some of the linguistic nuances that can really, I think, make all the difference.
Okay, cool. So the source immediately highlights the vulnerabilities of digital ticketing.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got huge crowds.
Absolutely. I mean, it specifically points out that, QR codes are great, but they can backfire if networks are overloaded or apps malfunction. And so the guide really emphasizes the importance of, loading up your e-tickets offline before you even get to the stadium.
Right. So you can avoid those really last-minute kind of heart attack moments.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say, hypothetically, you've forgotten to do that. Does the source offer any solutions, any alternative solutions?
Yeah, for sure. It recommends having screenshots of your tickets, readily available.
Yeah.
As a backup. And it also says that most venues will have designated help desks that are equipped to handle these digital ticketing issues. And they can verify your purchase, if you have to go that route.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Now, timing, of course. We all know that getting there early is important, but the source actually gives us a much more specific time frame.
Yeah, they really, really emphasize arriving at least 30 minutes before what they call, and this is an interesting collocation, kickoff time, which is worth kind of noting because it gives you enough time for security checks and navigating the crowds and even finding your seat without having to feel rushed or stressed.
Oh, I've had some close calls in the past because I haven't given myself enough time. The source also talks about making security checks as efficient as possible because nobody enjoys those long queues.
No, for sure. And the guide recommends that you really just try to minimize your baggage. Just the fewer items you carry, the less likely you are to be what the source calls set aside for additional screening.
I actually highlighted that term, set aside.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was really interesting. And the source defines it as being pulled aside, for further inspection, which can obviously significantly delay not only your own entry, but also the whole line.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Set aside is it's important to understand that word.
Yes.
It can be a real pain and a source of frustration and delay for everyone involved.
Now let's move into I guess you could say the linguistic part of stadium entry, because you could do everything right in terms of timing and preparation. But then if you don't communicate well, things can fall apart.
Yeah.
And the source gives us this really interesting section on common mistakes to avoid.
Yes. And these mistakes often stem from using incorrect or overly informal English phrases when you're interacting with the stadium staff. And it's really clear, concise, and polite communication is just so important for a smooth entry.
Right. Absolutely. And the source gives a very specific example of what not to say if your digital ticket fails to display properly. And it says to avoid anything like, phone show ticket, no. Help me quick.
Right. I mean, that phrase, it's not only grammatically incorrect, but it just lacks, the necessary politeness and clarity. So instead, the guide suggests something more like, my digital ticket isn't displaying properly. May I get assistance verifying my purchase?
Right. So much better. So much clearer.
Much clearer. It leaves no room for misinterpretation.
Right. So effective communication minimizes the risk of any kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And helps make sure that your request is dealt with, quickly and efficiently.
Exactly.
The source then goes on to highlight another common pitfall, which is trying to bypass the queue. And it says to particularly avoid phrases like, let me pass line. No, wait.
Yeah, and it comes across as rude and entitled. The guide suggests a more appropriate way to deal with that situation, which would be to say something like, I'd appreciate it if there's a faster queue available for those with e-tickets. Is that possible?
Right. So that acknowledges the system that's already in place. And you're politely asking if there's another option.
Yeah, exactly. And that just shows that linguistic awareness, which can really improve your entry into the stadium, your whole experience.
Now, before we go into some very specific stadium scenarios, the source introduces us to a really useful phrasal verb, which is to sort out.
Yes, sort out. It's such a great phrase for resolving any kind of unexpected issue, especially when you're under time pressure. It basically means to just find a solution to a problem or confusion.
So it's really versatile. You can use it in so many situations, from ticket discrepancies to technical hiccups. And the source gives a really good example of how to use sort out Let's say you have a mix-up with your seat assignments.
Right. So your ticket is displaying the wrong information. So you approach staff and you could say something like, could you please help me sort out this seating issue? My ticket seems to have the wrong information.
Perfect.
Yeah.
You've stated the problem. You've explained what's going on. You've asked for help. I mean, that's really good. The source also makes a point of highlighting the physical ticket scanner itself.
Yes, because they can malfunction.
Yeah.
Especially in direct sunlight, or if there are just some kind of technical glitches.
So even with a valid ticket, you can run into problems.
Absolutely.
And the guide really emphasizes having those backup options, like screenshots or knowing where the help desk is located.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's move to a specific area of the stadium that often presents unique challenges, and that is the standing section.
Right, and they define this, as a designated area where spectators stand throughout the match. And it's obviously known for its, very energetic atmosphere. But it can also get very crowded.
Yeah. I mean, from personal experience, I've been in some pretty intense standing sections, particularly, when something really important is happening in the match. And the source contrasts this experience with seated areas.
Yes. And it highlights that, in a seated area, you have a more relaxed, controlled environment. Whereas the standing section, it's very immersive, but it's also high energy. So it depends what you're looking for.
So it really comes down to personal preference.
Yeah.
And what kind of match it is. I guess, some fans really thrive in that high energy environment of a standing section, whereas others prefer to sit comfortably and have an unobstructed view.
Exactly. And so understanding those nuances, I think, helps fans make a more informed decision.
Yeah.
Based on, their desired level of comfort and engagement.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Knowing what to expect can make a huge difference to your enjoyment of the match. So I think it's time for us to take a little break. And when we come back, we'll continue our exploration of this topic.
Yes, looking forward to it. So let's dig a little deeper into some practical strategies for how to navigate stadium entry. And the source, gives us quite a bit of information on that.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in what it says about managing crowds, especially, during those high-profile matches.
Yeah.
It can get pretty crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the guide really emphasizes that it's important to be familiar with the layout of the stadium beforehand, particularly the locations of the entry gates and security checkpoints, and obviously where your seating section is.
So you can avoid wasting time, wandering around trying to figure out where to go.
Exactly. It's like having a mental map of the stadium in your head before you even get there. And then the source also talks about the importance of maintaining situational awareness, within the crowd, being mindful of, bottlenecks or surges in movement, because crowds can be unpredictable.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up, especially during a big game. So the guide suggests staying aware of designated walkways and trying to avoid, narrow passageways or areas that tend to get congested.
Okay. So just be smart. Be aware.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about a very specific linguistic challenge that a lot of people face at stadium entry, and that is how to communicate when you're having problems with your ticket.
Yes, because in those situations, I think being able to express yourself clearly and precisely is really important.
Absolutely. And the source gives us some excellent examples of how to phrase things effectively. So for instance, if the ticket scanner, it's not reading your digital ticket, it's failing repeatedly, the guide recommends you don't say things like, no, it's not working, or what's wrong with this thing instead. It suggests a more helpful phrase, which would be something like, my ticket isn't scanning properly, could you please assist me?
So you're stating the problem clearly, you're not getting frustrated or angry, and you're asking for help. I mean, that makes so much more sense.
Exactly. It's all about, accurately conveying the problem in a respectful way so that the staff can help you efficiently.
Right. Because good communication can actually really de-escalate those situations and make sure that you get the assistance you need. Okay, let's look at another scenario. So you think you're in the wrong queue.
Okay.
What do you do? What do you say?
Well, the source cautions against using overly informal language or demanding language, like, I'm in the wrong line, let me through, that kind of thing.
Which is just going to annoy everybody.
Exactly. It's much better to take a more courteous approach and say something like, excuse me, I believe I may be in the wrong queue. Could you please direct me to the appropriate line for e-ticket holders?
Right. So you're acknowledging that you might have made a mistake. And you're politely asking for guidance.
Exactly. And that kind of linguistic finesse, it really can make a big difference to how people respond to you and how smoothly the whole process goes.
Okay, so the source also digs into some of the nuances of language in terms of using specific phrasal verbs and collocations.
Yeah.
To really navigate stadium entry effectively. We've already talked about sort out, but there's another good one, which is head towards.
Yeah. Head towards basically means to move in a particular direction. It's pretty simple, but it's very commonly used in stadium directions. So if staff member says, head towards gate A, they're telling you which way to go to get to where you need to be.
Okay.
Easy enough. Easy enough. And then there's a collocation, which is standing room only.
Standing room only.
Which basically means that all the designated seats are taken in a particular section or area.
Yeah.
And so there's only standing space left.
Right.
And that's really important to know because especially if you arrive late or it's a very popular match, you might find yourself in a situation where there's only standing room left. And that's not ideal for everybody.
Okay, so are there any other, tips or advice that the source gives to help us really maximize our enjoyment of, being at the stadium?
Well, it gives some bonus tips, which I thought were quite helpful, particularly about food and beverages. And it recommends, before you even get to the stadium, just familiarize yourself with the policies. Because some places have restrictions on outside food and drinks. And then it also suggests identifying, where the concession stands are located, early on, so that you don't end up in huge queues.
Right, because there's nothing worse than missing,
Yeah.
that crucial goal, because you're waiting in line to buy a hot dog.
Okay.
So the source ends with a final challenge.
Yes, it does.
And it's designed to really put all of this, newly acquired knowledge to the test.
Let's imagine you're at the stadium entrance, you've arrived early, but there's a really long security queue.
Yeah.
And you're a little bit surprised.
Go.
So how would you politely inquire about the reason for the delay and the estimated waiting time? And you have to use at least one phrasal verb and one collocation that we've discussed.
Okay. Let me see. Let me think. Okay, so I would say something like, excuse me, I'm heading towards section C, but the security queue seems unusually long. Could you please give me an idea of how long it will take to get through? Is there a standing room only situation that's causing this delay?
Excellent. You've used heading towards, you've used standing room only, and you've done it all in a very polite and respectful way.
I feel like I'm getting the hang of this.
Yeah, absolutely. You're really grasping these concepts.
Okay, so before we wrap up this segment, I want to touch on something that I think is really important, and that's the cultural aspect of stadium entry.
Right. Because, stadium etiquette and fan behavior, they can differ quite significantly from culture to culture, from region to region.
And the source does touch on this, briefly. And it stresses how important it is to be culturally sensitive and aware when you're attending matches in unfamiliar places.
Yeah, you really need to do your research. Before you go, understand what the local customs are in terms of queuing personal space, interacting with staff. Because what might be completely fine in one country could be considered rude or inappropriate somewhere else.
Yeah. A good example of that is pushing or jostling in a queue. It might be tolerated in some places, but in others, it would be seen as a really serious breach of etiquette.
Exactly. And so understanding those nuances, it prevents misunderstandings, and it can really improve your overall experience, especially if you're a guest in a foreign stadium.
Right. So it's not just about being logistically prepared, but also about being, culturally sensitive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're ready to move on to our final segment.
Yes, let's do that. Okay, so building on that idea of cultural sensitivity, the source makes a really interesting point about using stadium facilities during the match.
Yeah, it specifically says that you should try to avoid leaving your seat, to go to the bathroom or buy food and drinks during really crucial moments, because it can obstruct other people's view and just be kind of inconsiderate.
Right, so even if it seems like a small thing to you, it can actually be a real nuisance to the people around you.
Absolutely. It's all about being aware of your surroundings and the people you're sharing the experience with. So the guide recommends, planning those breaks strategically, like maybe during halftime or when there's a lull in the action.
Okay, so I think it's time to revisit that final challenge scenario.
Yeah, let's do it.
One last time, just to make sure that we've really absorbed all this information. So could you remind everybody of the scenario?
Okay, so you've arrived at the stadium.
Yeah.
You're heading to your section. When you get to security, there's a really, really long queue, much longer than you expected.
Okay.
And you want to find out why and how long it's going to take to get through. So how would you phrase that? Using at least one phrasal verb and one collocation.
Okay. See, excuse me. I'm heading towards Section C, but there seems to be a bit of a bottleneck at security. Could you tell me what's causing the delay? And maybe give me a rough estimate of how long I should expect to wait.
Perfect. You've got heading towards in there. You've clearly described the situation using bottleneck, and you've politely requested the information you need.
Well, I have to say, I feel a lot more confident now about navigating stadium entry. Not just, in terms of the practical stuff, but also how to communicate effectively.
That's great to hear. I mean, that's really what this deep dive has been all about, giving you the tools and the language to make the whole experience as smooth and enjoyable as possible.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything.
Yeah, I think so.
So to wrap up, I think the key takeaways here are to be prepared. Do your research ahead of time. Communicate clearly and politely with stadium staff. And be mindful of the cultural context.
Absolutely. And if you can do all of that, you're going to have a much better time and be able to focus on what really matters, which is enjoying the match.
So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. And thank you to our expert for all your insights.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening, and goodbye.